for hanging out with us. So we're doing our Job post-series podcast. Normally we get into the nuggets, but we have a special guest with us, Keslie Doan, who's actually the coordinator for spiritual formation at GCU.
Yeah.
So we're going to spend some time diving into some of the things that we did and didn't dive into in the book of Job. Keslie has a really unique perspective on the book of Job. It's one of her favorite, or I think your favorite book
I think my favorite.
of the Bible. So
It's
we're going
a
to
bold thing to say.
I know. We'll
It's a bold
see.
thing to say.
Yeah. So really, we're just here to nerd out a little bit and talk about diving in deeper to the book of Job. And we were just saying a couple minutes ago on camera, we could have easily done this book for a whole year. And then we could have done it again from a different perspective, and then probably a third time from a different perspective, because it is just, it's meant to be read and meditated on for a lifetime. And so 8 sermons over one summer just barely
Felt
begins
kamikaze to me. It was tough to get through it.
Yeah. But maybe before we dive in, Keslie, could you kind of tell us a little bit who you are,
Sure.
your time at Living Streams and what you do, because I think you're probably a new person for a lot of people watching with us.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, guys. It's fun to get to, be listening through the sermon series, and then now kind of get to see, some behind the scenes of what's happened, pick your guys' brain a little bit. So I've been coming to Living Streams for, I think 5 or 6 years. And I'm from the Valley, local, was on staff at a church before then, and then found Living Streams and wasn't planning on staying, was kind of just going to use it as a stopover and have never left, and just so grateful for it. And so I work at GCU, get to hang out with college kids all day, which is the best and so much fun, and they're wild and crazy and teach me so much about Jesus. And so I work in the Office of Spiritual Life. We do a bunch of different things like our chapel services and life groups and outreach and really wonderful things. And what I get to do is help run our spiritual formation program. So what that looks like is teaching students about spiritual disciplines and spiritual practices, and really help them go from just professing Christianity to practicing it, and actually giving them a framework of how to do that. Not just like, hey, here's a great talk, hope it inspires you, which is so important.
Yeah.
But giving them some, I kind of call it like a toolbox of you can kind of pull this out, like lament, like we'll probably talk about today, of what is that and how does that actually look like, and what is that in your life for a 19, 20-year-old when your world falls apart or the world around us is falling apart. So yeah, it's really fun. I love getting to work there.
Yeah,
Awesome.
I'm excited to hear more about that. When we were talking on the phone, you were sharing a little bit of your perspective on Job, sharing about kind of some of the practical aspects of lament. So I'm excited to talk about that a little bit later on today in the podcast. But Ryan, you had a couple of messages in this series. You got to wrap us up.
I got to bookend it, which I feel like is hard and easy at the same time. Like there's Job, you got like chapter 1 and 2. Then you have a lot of talking, and then you have chapter 42. And it's like the wrapping up and summarizing it was tough. But I think when I first dove into it, we had spent so much time studying it. So I don't even know how long ago we decided to do Job, but more than 6 months ago. And we had been studying Job. We had been going through some different things. I heard an interview from this guy named Christopher Ash. He wrote one of the best books, I feel like, on Job in terms of it's a real quick summary of what is it about, how is Jesus found in the book of Job, and it was just so interesting. So read his book, we were reading his book, chewing on it, agreeing with it, disagreeing with it, and so by the time we got into week 1, I felt like I have so many things to say. I don't know how to strip this back. But the main thing for me is, I was looking at the book of Job, I think so many people approach it and they go, read this if you're going through a hard time and it will help you out. And I'm like, that is not the purpose of the book of Job. It is not a book of answers. I mean, Job has all these questions, and when God shows up, he doesn't answer any of them. He doesn't go through, okay, here's point 1, let me answer you here. So obviously there's some tension that the Lord is okay with. Obviously there's some things for us that are real sticky, and even as Christians I feel like we're real reticent to jump into. But it's so important when you look at the book of Job to understand this is a messy book, just like life is messy, So for me, I was trying to summarize it. I'm like, okay, if it's not the book for why do bad things happen to good people, what is this a book of? And I just kept coming back to the word wrestling. This is a book of Job wrestling with God, kind of like Jacob wrestled with God, kind of like Israel is wrestling with God. There's this sort of thing that you read into it and you realize that God is okay with tension. He's okay with a little bit of wrestling and hard questions. And I thought for our community, I'm like, this is the real beauty of Job. Not that it's a book of easy answers, but it's a book of wrestling. Mm-hmm. And then you get into the Satan coming in there. And to me, the biggest thing is you feel like as a Christian that shouldn't be. Like, you hear things like, God cannot handle any, unclean thing in his presence. And yet in the book of Job, Satan shows up to him and he's talking to him. So you're going, okay, some of our assumptions and maybe big things that we say about the character of God, we have to be open to have discussion about it. But did Satan crash the party? I don't know. Did God invite Satan to the table? I don't know. And that was one thing I wish I could have unpacked a little bit more, because the more I started thinking about that, the more I thought, well, is it problematic in some ways, at least on an emotional, theological level, that God allows evil in the world? Well, yeah, that brings up some tension. And is it a problem in some ways, and problems maybe not the word, does it bring tension, the fact that Satan comes to God and says, can I do this? And God says yes, Yeah. But the more I was chewing on it, I thought, well, isn't that better than Satan being the equal to God, and he could do whatever he wants, and God's just trying to figure out how to make it turn to good? Well, no, God's completely in charge. And the way that Christopher Ashe says it, it's like Satan's a dog on a leash. Yeah. Like, he has power, but God is reining him in. And I think that when you're looking at the book of Job, those are the kind of things that I'm like, I wish I could unpack that a little bit further, because that feels weird to us in normal Christian world,
Yeah. And to your wrestling point, it's like the whole book of Job, I feel like, is I couldn't agree more that that's where you land on with it, right? Because it isn't a book of answers, but it's a book of questions that are intentionally meant to sit a little bit of heartburn or something, you know what I mean? Sit oddly or weird or uncomfortably, because they're real life. I love that the Bible, it's not cheap. I mean, this is one of the most amazing pieces of literature to have ever been written. Yeah. It's no mistake that we've held on to it for thousands of years. Yes. The Bible in its entirety, but also specifically the book of Job here, it's not the cheap, easy, lazy answers that, Christians are often, what's the word I'm looking for? Accused. I won't say confused. That's not the right. I was confused. That the Christians are often accused of giving. It's exactly the opposite. It doesn't give answers. I love to compare the book of Job to the movie Inception. Because that movie. Oh man, it's so good. And then you get to the, spoiler alert, right? You get to the end of the movie, right? And that's what the whole movie is like, leading to this one moment that doesn't resolve, right? The top is spinning, and it represents whether or not the whole thing was a dream or not, basically, right? Yep. And then you see the top begin to wobble a little bit, but it's still going solid, and then the movie cuts, and you're left to wonder, well, which was it?
Yeah, was this real or not?
And you realize the whole movie was this movie if the top falls, and the whole movie was that movie if the top doesn't fall. Yeah. And my take on that is that was on purpose. I mean, obviously, of course it was on purpose, but somehow that seams contentious because everybody says it fell or it didn't fall. You know?
Yeah.
And I would say
there's
no.
a third option.
Yeah, I think it was a beautiful piece of art, that a movie that was masterfully composed to be two different movies in parallel. Yeah. And depending on whether it falls or not, and you'll never know whether it falls or not because it was supposed to be both at the same time. Yeah. And the book of Job in a lot of ways is that way, although I think there are answers to the questions that the book of Job poses, but the book of Job does not show you if the top falls or not. Yeah. The book of Job does not give you a clean resolve. It's meant, and because what happens the moment you finished watching Inception in the movie theater the first time or on the couch with your friends the very first time you watched it, what happened? Movie cuts and you're immediately talking with all of your friends. Did it fall? Did it not fall? And you continue to do so. And here we are years after the movie's released and we're still saying, did it fall or not fall? And I feel like I've got a hot take, that it did and didn't,
Yeah.
And And so we're thinking about it a lot more. And the book of Job could give you the answers that it poses, I think. I think there are answers to many of the questions.
Yeah.
But it doesn't give them because the value is in the wrestling.
Yeah.
Because there are some answers that just won't satisfy when they're written on a page.
Yeah.
They have to be fought through. You have to gain the answer to that question by wrestling with the Lord. And certainly if the point of all of it is relationship with the Lord, then knowing the answer might actually have you escape from actually holding the answer, which is nearness to the Lord.
Yeah,
That's
for
a great
sure.
point. It's like you kept saying, just stay at the table. Like that's, and I think you said that maybe in a couple of your sermons of kind of the beauty here is you stay at the table. You know, that's what we can take away is what does it look like for you in your wrestling to stay at the table, which I thought was so helpful, you know, in a book that can be so confusing, but to kind of have a nugget to hold on to.
Yeah. Well, and David and I were talking a lot about Job is deconstructing in a lot of ways, which is a buzzword right now. And maybe
Definitely
people who don't do church
college
as like,
students, it's a
college
buzzword.
students, a big buzzword. But Job is asking a lot of questions. But the thing that separates Job is he doesn't go into maybe the laziness of legalism, which I feel like his friends are going into. This like, oh, well, if God's like this and this is how it is, then just repent. Like, just give up, Job. Like, these are the rules. Just follow them, you know. And Job's sitting there going, no, this is not, you put this into God and then you get that out every time. It's a lot more complicated. So he doesn't dive into for me, I think the emotional laziness of legalism is the only way I could think of it. Like legalistic people are like, I don't want to chew on that. I don't want to keep asking the questions. I'm just going to choose to just believe this and give up, you know. Nor did he, at the end of his deconstruction, just throw it all away and say, you know what, this whole God thing is ridiculous. I'm not in, you know. And he just stayed in that tension. He stayed in that middle place. And that is the wrestling of Job that I feel like is so beautiful and really represents so much of my walk with God. I go, yeah, there's many times where I'm like, I don't know. I don't know the answer to this question. And I could go this way or I could go that way. And it's hard to stay in the middle and to keep wrestling. But there's something about that obviously God honors and loves, you know.
And I loved and I hated when you used that word because I really liked that word when people first started using it. You know, it's gained a connotation that means walking away from the Lord and creating my own religion that loosely resembles Christianity. But really what the denotation of the word, the definition of that word, I would imagine is something more like, you know, when I was a kid and I was very messy and I had a room that was out of control and I didn't know how to clean it, you know what I mean? It was like, you know, I was told, well, just go to your giant pile of mess and then start breaking it into other piles and then work from there.
Yes.
You know, so it's like, well, here's my trash pile, here's my goodwill pile, here's my keep pile, here's my, you know, needs to go in another room of the house pile or whatever. And when I would say the healthy kind of deconstruction would be when you say, okay, let me break everything into its pieces and let me say, where are the things that are lies that I've been believing and holding as a part, and maybe I inherited from my tradition or my family or that I just came to realize but didn't know that they were, came to believe but didn't know that they were lies, or the things that are neither here nor there. They're just helpful bits. They're elements of culture or things like that are a part of my walk with the Lord, my tradition or my, you know, and they're perfectly fine. But let me just realize that those are not black and white. They're okay this way, that way, whatever. And what are the things that are actually true, that are solid and dependable? And if we deconstruct and break them into those three pieces, I can say, well, let's get rid of this pile. Let's get rid of the pile of lies. And then let's hold the pile of kind of that just culturally things that actually are relative, that are okay here and not there, or better here but worse there, and just realize that I can hold those open-handedly. And then let's cling to the truth. Let's cling to what's right and what's real and what's good. But what a lot of people seem to do is they just say, well, let me separate things into things that I hate, don't care about, and like. And let me leave only the pile of what I like, of what feels good to me. And that's Job is a great example of how to deconstruct in a healthy way. I'd say there's a solid argument for maybe just throwing that word away because of the connotations that it has. But reclaiming it, there's another argument for that too.
I feel like hourly,
Seriously.
Yeah, very true.
But in the truest sense, I think somebody who's asking questions, Job, it really shows that. How to ask good questions, but not to give up on it and to stay at the table.
Because he stays rooted in the goodness of God. He doesn't, even when there's so much evidence to the contrary of God's goodness, Job knows, no, somehow, like there's something about my walk with the Lord, something about the interactions I've had with the Lord that gives me a confidence, even though I feel very shaky in that confidence, that God is still good. And so let me show up and yell at him, basically. And I always give that example when I talk about it. It's like when if you and I were good friends and you came into the room and you said, hey, how's it going? And I said, fine. And I said, are you mad at me? No.
Clearly.
Yeah, right? Like,
Clearly you're mad.
If we have that interaction, I'm not honoring our relationship. Right. There may be a part of me that thinks I'm keeping the peace, I'm just going to shove it down and not talk about it. But I'm not honoring our relationship. I'm actually creating distance. I'm actually pushing you away in my decision to not talk about the thing that when you clearly know there's something to talk about. And I think oftentimes we do that with the Lord. People do that with the Lord where, they're hurting, they're angry, they're sad, they're grieving, they're mad at the Lord. And they think, well, God is God. He's powerful. He's big. If I'm mad at him, he's going to slap me. So I'm just going to say, it's fine. It's fine, God. And you're not honoring him. What's actually more honoring would be, if you walk in and you're mad and I yell at you and I tell you why I'm mad at you and I say like, this is frustrating. You did this. I can't believe that you would do this. Because then I'm obviously the best scenario would be to calmly explain my feelings and give you some, when you this, I feel this kind of statements or whatever. But even if I yell at you, like I'm actually coming to the table and giving you an opportunity to say, oh my gosh, here's a misunderstanding, or even, oh my gosh, I'm wrong.
Well, you're fighting for the friendship in that point,
exactly.
Which is what Job does, is like he's fighting for it. If he didn't care, if he wanted to move on, he'd be like, okay, God, there's so much evidence, and I love that word that you use, the evidence. There's too much evidence against why you're not good. And everyone else is highlighting this evidence. And so I'm going to go on the evidence and I'm not going to fight for it, which is particularly hard to ask people to do in the midst of suffering. And it seems like that's why deconstruction is such a hot topic, in the sense of it often comes out of a real raw trauma and suffering. And so then to clap back intensely, as sometimes I want to do with deconstruction, like, don't do it, stay at the table. No, it's like, it is often born out of deep trauma and pain. And so to ask or invite people or model, hey, stay at the table, is like, how do you want me to stay at the table? Everything around me is evidence for why I shouldn't. And so it's Job is just so unique in that, and models that we can, but we can do it not being like, okay, God, you go first. And it's like, I'm gonna talk first. Like, here's what's wrong. Here's when it went south, And so I love that Job really fights for it.
When you're teaching Job, how do you traverse that first bit? Because there are so many things in that first chapter. There's so many things I'm like, you could talk about that or that or that, or that, and you feel like if I only talk a little bit about the Satan, I feel like I'm leaving so much out.
Gosh, I mean, the times that I have taught it, I always wish, to your point, that I had way more time. Whether it's like, is it a challenger? Is it an angel? Is it the enemy? Like, who is that character in there? I don't know. I really try to highlight, particularly, it depends on the context, Job's response in that moment of that he tore his robe and he worshiped, right? And so tearing of the robe was that sign in Jewish culture and Hebrew culture of just kind of this idea of mourning, right? And so just being like, man, everything in me is mourning this. And so kind of in essence, he was lamenting in that way. And he really does lament later on in, I think, chapter 3. But that his response was like so honest. It wasn't, okay, God, whatever you say, life sucks. It's like he was not well.
Yes, yeah.
And yet he worshiped somehow. Like that is, and so based on my work that I do with spiritual practices and spiritual disciplines of just talking about like that is, I can almost guarantee, which you shouldn't guarantee because I don't know the backstory, but I could almost guarantee that's not the first time Job did that. That is not formed out of instinct. I was watching, I don't know if you guys have seen the Derek Jeter docuseries that's on. It's called The Captain. It's incredible. And if you're a baseball fan or love sports history, Highly recommend it. But I was watching an episode the other night, and they were talking about the 2001 American League Championship Series. He's a Yankee. He's playing shortstop, obviously, and he makes this incredible play where he comes across the diamond to the first base line to catch and kind of a poor throw from the right fielder to home base, and the guy gets out at home, and it's this wild play. And the commentator is talking about this, and he's like, everyone the next day in the papers was saying that was a great baseball instinct. Like that was just great instincts. And the commentator said that wasn't a great play of instincts, that was a great play of practice and muscle memory. Yeah. And so that's often what I try to point to in Job without taking too much out of context of, I imagine he had a practice of worship, and I imagine he had a practice of lament in that when we hop onto the scene in chapter 1, it's not his chapter 1. And so although it seems like his life was great and easy, I'm sure there were moments of real pain. And so what does that look like for us to build that muscle memory in us? So then when suffering comes, as it will, it's not the first time we're banking on instinct. Yeah,
that was actually one of the key things that we honed in on when we were talking about we mapped things out, and then we said, okay, what are our filters? Like, we can't do everything, we can't dive, but what do we want to happen through this series? And that was one of the big things that not to give a second, absolutely to give a second analogy, the exact same thing.
Yes, I was going to say, you said muscle memory too.
Yeah. But that was exactly, and I think we talked about it on the phone last week too, and there was this, we were saying, like, what we want is we want people to have exactly that experience, right? Because the book of Job, its utility in suffering is much more, like you said, like before. Like, don't give it to someone through suffering. Yeah. I mean, maybe because like better late than never, I suppose.
Sure.
But really give it to someone years before the suffering hits. And there was this movie, and I can't even remember the name of the movie, but it's Tom Hanks in an airplane that was crashing or whatever.
And it wasn't Castaway?
No, it wasn't Castle. Yeah, well, I know.
Like,
he goes down on a lot of planes. I think
it
was Tom Hanks anyway. But it was actually on the plane. What the whole movie was about, the plane going down, and there was this moment which just weirdly like tugged at my heartstrings, and I makes me want to cry even thinking about it sometimes, even though it's like you're weird. Why is that making me emotional? I think just because pedal to the metal moment, but where the plane is starting to go down, and all the flight attendants, they do their thing. They have this chant tuck your knees, masks on, buckle up. What I don't remember. They have this chant that they're repeating over and over and over again. All 5, 6, 7, 10 of however many flight attendants are on the plane. And they're getting buckled into their little flight attendant seats or whatever, and they're just in it. It's like, this is happening, this moment they've trained for that has, and that feeling when you get on the plane, they're like, and you put the mask on and you buckle and you're like, whatever, you're just like on your phone, even though you're supposed to be on airplane mode, and getting your last text message and, and you imagine for the flight attendants, it's the same thing. When they do training, it's like, plane's never going down, right?
Right.
But now all of a sudden they've had this burned into their mind. The moment that was never supposed to happen is happening, and they're just boom. They're prepared. It's muscle memory. They know what's going on. And that was our big hope. Was exactly what you're talking about. Is that it would be, it would be a moment of good practice.
Totally.
That it's like when that happens. And the thing is planes don't go down often.
Right.
But you're gonna have suffering. Like, it's going to happen. You're going to hit a moment where everything's going to feel like it's crumbling. And so you can guarantee that the practice that you invest, that the wrestling with God that you invest now, years before you lose a child, you go through divorce, you experience a great tragedy, you lose your job, whatever it may be, that you're going to put that into practice.
And that's the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And I feel like there's a reason why that's the most known verse in Job.
But most people probably have no idea
They have
where
no
it's
idea.
from.
I know. And the context of it is beautiful because it's that muscle memory. It's that things have gone wrong. And I don't know much, but I do know this. God is sovereign. He's in charge. Blessed be his name. Like, this is all he has to bring to the table. And I think a lot of times we think, I think we struggle with the sovereignty of God. We always wanted to talk about whatever spiritual authority we have. We're going to take the spiritual authority. All of that's true. All of that's good. Prayer is good. All of that's great. But there are these moments where you crash into the sovereignty of God and you have a choice. Do I lament, and second guess God, which Job eventually gets into. But Job's very first response is, I trust you, God. No matter what, I trust you. And I feel like even though he went into a season of being frustrated and asking a lot of questions, that first reaction was so key. And a lot of us, I think, and we talked about this when tragedy strikes, that first moment, you have a choice to make, how you're going to respond. Because, afterward, it's going to get harder. The longer that thing goes on, the more that Job is processing, my kids aren't going to come to my house anymore and have special dinners. The more that Job is thinking of that, the more questions that God is bringing. But he laid that foundation of worship right off the bat, and that was his muscle memory.
Yeah.
And his trust in the Lord, it's not like some magical fortitude that he was gifted with that you and I just don't happen to have. It was an intentional decision. It's much like the man who says, I believe, help my unbelief. Like he comes to the Lord and he's essentially saying, I trust you, but I don't trust you. But I still trust you with just like a pinky toe in the place of trust, just enough to cling to that. That was actually one of the things that I, like in the whole series, one of the big things that I was like, oh, it's a bummer we didn't get into this one. It was one of the topics we had discussed maybe for messages didn't end up manifesting, which is really like Job's progressive revelation of Jesus throughout the book of Job. Right. And it's a really beautiful thing to track as you go through all of the story. And, in chapter 9, he says, there's no arbiter between me and God. Yeah. He said, what am I going to do? Like, I feel like I've been wronged and God is perhaps in the wrong, but also I kind of like, I'm going to show up and I'm going to yell at God about it and not run away from him. But what am I going to do? Who's going to go between me and God?
And his comforters are going, nobody. You can't go to God. That's not even an option here, Job. Yeah.
And then in chapter 13, then he says, though he slay me, yet I will trust in the Lord. He said, I'm going to stay rooted in God. I don't get it. It's not right. I'm hopeless. There's no one to go bring my case before the Lord. And then in chapter 16, somewhere between chapter 9 when he says there's no arbiter and chapter 16 he says, even now my witness is in heaven, he who testifies for me is on high. Somehow he realized, wait a minute. Somehow I think there's a witness. I think there's someone, there's not no arbiter for me. There's someone who's in heaven, who's on high, who's bringing who's a witness that has been called to the stands on my behalf in heaven. And then in 19, he makes this powerful statement. He says, I know that my Redeemer lives. And he says, and then at last he will stand upon the earth. And there's just this beautiful, like, where did that come from?
Yeah.
This guy, this is hundreds, probably thousands of years before the incarnation, before Jesus, before the thing that we celebrate on Christmas, and certainly before the death, the crucifixion, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And yet he knows that he has a Redeemer who lives. Well, where is that? I mean, he can't be talking about a cousin, because where's his cousin? He doesn't. He's got three people and one random guy a fourth random guy who show up. No family has come to him. It doesn't seem that he has a Redeemer. And that term is a really weighty term, right, in the Bible, redemption. It's one of those Christian words that goes over our heads, but when you dig into it, actually the Hebrew word is Gaal, which it's often kinsman redeemer is something you might hear people say, but I think probably the closest thing we might have in our culture would maybe be like next of kin. It's a familial relational term that also bears with it some level of legal responsibility. But it's obviously a much bigger term than next of kin, right? And so there's a handful of responsibilities that boil down for the Gaal, for the kinsman redeemer, right? And that primarily their role is to get compensation for you. That's the second point I would make. But their more frequent role would be actually to like redeem, like what we see in the book of Ruth, right? To redeem an inheritance or something that was yours that was lost or that you sold away, maybe foolishly or out of necessity, a famine, So that their job, if you sold your field, your inheritance, so to say, was to say, well, okay, I have the money to buy it back for you. So I'll buy that back for you. And then the other big role that they might have, which hopefully doesn't happen too often, is actually to avenge you, right? To actually get back what's owed to you. If it's financially countable, it'd be 120%, right? So if I kill Ryan's donkey, then my kinsman redeemer, my brother, my cousin, or whatever, their job is to go and get a donkey and a chicken from you.
Appreciate that.
I
could get behind that.
Yeah, 120%. That feels good.
Maybe 2 chickens.
Yeah. 2 chickens.
If it's by weight,
2
it would be at
chickens.
least 2 chickens.
That makes sense. Because 10 chickens equals 1 donkey. We all know that. It's basic math. Right?
Basic kindergarten math.
Yes.
But then in the circumstance where you're murdered, the 120% is to be avenged, right? In a system where you don't have, you don't have an electric chair or whatever, you don't have a system for capital punishment. That's the system. Is the kinsman redeemer's job, if you've been wrongfully murdered, their job is to go get the guy who got you. Yeah. Their job is to avenge you, blood for blood there. So their main roles, right, are to buy back what you lost or sold, and then to avenge you if need be. And so Job is having this realization. He says, there's someone who can buy back what I've lost, and there's someone who can pay for, who can take care of, who can avenge the wrong that's been done to me, who can take care of that death debt. Yeah. And that's the beauty, that it's, how does he realize this? How does he see that there was this incarnate deity, that there was a Son of God who would be fully God, fully man, that would be fully man as our kinsman redeemer, able to be peers of ours, able to buy back what we lost, what we sold foolishly or by bad circumstances, and also the one whose job it was to get the death for the sin that we had done. Jesus is both the one who claims the debt that we owe, and the one who forgives it. And Job, just in the wrestling, he realizes,
wild.
before God even shows up and says anything, somehow in the wrestling, he realizes, man, Jesus.
Yeah, one of the phrases we use is, there are some hungers that are created by the book of Job that only Jesus satiates. So it's like, there's a real gap in there. I think if the book of Job without Jesus makes God look very heartless and very separate from everybody. He's kind of going, look, I've got this thing sewn up. You have no idea. And that's true. And that's right. But God is separate from our suffering, if not for Jesus. Jesus is that gap in Job where we go, no, he can empathize with us because he was rejected. Yeah. He can empathize with us because he lost everything. He questioned God. Why are you forsaking me? Like there are some very real connections between Jesus and Job. And that was our trick, right? It's like, this isn't just a interesting theological exercise to go through the book of Job, but there is some real things that point us to the Redeemer of Jesus. And he says in there, if only I had an advocate. Yeah. If only I had somebody that could hear me and plead my case to God. And that is a beautiful thing, So.
Yeah, and if it's wisdom literature, right? So it's what's the wisdom we can gain from it too? And it's it makes me so grateful that Jesus says I can't remember where, but that he intercedes for us.
Yes,
and so when I'm going through suffering, whatever level, whatever it may be, it's I have that person who is standing in the gap. I have that person who is interceding on my behalf that Job was maybe longing for or imagining in some crazy Holy Spirit, weird Old Testament way, right?
Exactly.
They're like how he got there. But that we get that and that's just so cool. And why we can look at this story and say, man, it's different for us. Like there is parts that we get that maybe Job had a glimpse of or that God revealed to him in unique ways, but we have Jesus in that. And that we have now can look back and watch through scripture, Jesus suffer and say, man, we have even more evidence of why he cares and why he gets suffering because he suffered way more than we ever will. And he did it beautifully and for us because he loves us. And still he is interceding on our behalf, whatever our suffering is.
There's that beautiful kind of prophetic Christophany in there where when he says, I know my Redeemer lives, you're like, who is this?
Like tell me more about what you know.
and we know, I mean, I think that's the beauty of Job, you know. But it's an interesting book. I mean, we talked a lot about this. It's kind of bookended by these sort of almost like a play. It's like the curtain opens and we meet this man, Job. And I said this in the last sermon that I gave on it, but we might ask the question and stumble over the question, why does God allow bad things to happen to good people? God is clearly not afraid of that question because Job is not just, why did bad things happen to good people? It's like he's the best person and the worst things happen to him, you know? And so for me, I was even just right off the bat going, there's something in our cultural Christianity that we're afraid to talk about this, or that we've handed over to maybe critics who would say, ha, gotcha. You know, God's not good because bad things happen. Job is this beautiful book where God's going, no, I understand that. I clearly see that. Yeah. And I'm not shying away from it. I'm not trying to give you this neat package, you know. And it's evidence in the sense that most of the book is poetry. And we talked about that. It's like, there's these prose, it's bookended by prose and this sort of Shakespearean-like setup to Job's life. But then we go into this poetry that's really wrapping all these questions that we would have, our experience with God, all the questions that we ask. And Job just interjects itself into that. That book of Job just interjects itself into that question. And it is the oldest, for us, the oldest written book in the Bible, though, you know, I'm not by any means saying it was the events happened chronologically before Adam and Eve, but really in terms of what we have with old manuscripts, it's the oldest that we have. And so there's something to me that the oldest book in the Bible is interjecting itself into the hardest questions that we ask of God. And I think there's been generations of people going, well, that is evidence that there's no God. Yeah. But I look at that and I go, no, that's evidence of a really good God. And you really can't get there without a deep dive into the book of Job. Like, I didn't like the book of Job. We read it and I listened to Christopher Ash sum it up. I was like, great, that sounds awesome. Then I read through it and I'd read the book of Job and probably just kind of like crossing it off on my Bible reading plan, honestly. Diving back into it the last 6 months, it was like the first read through, I'm like, I don't like this book. I don't like this, you know? Second time through, third time through, like the more I kind of ruminated on it, the more it became this thing where I'm like, no, I actually love this book. Yeah. I think it's so beautiful. And it's sad, I think, when church leaders shy away from diving into it. But it's not something you're going to get, you know, when you're ankle deep. You're going to have to work for it, you know?
Yeah, and I mean, the book, Christopher Ash's book, I think I would agree. It's probably one of the better books I've read on Job. I have hairs to split here or there, but how can you not in the book? Again, just like the end of Inception, you know? Did it fall? Did it not fall? We all feel very passionately, you know? I'd say the biggest hair I had to split with him is he dives really good into the mystery. He leaves space for that, talks about that. I think that's absolutely wonderful. And then I feel like he falls a little bit into the trap of blaming a little bit too much on Satan. Because I think that's actually to the point you just made of like, God's not afraid of this question. Yeah. It's clear he's not afraid of this question because the book of Job presents the most problematic scenario for, you know, in theodicy and in how is God good when he's all powerful and he could do anything about this and yet he doesn't. There's evil in the world because it literally just, we watch God giving permission for Satan to do horrible things. And then the author toys with the language. And at one point, what does he say? He says, you incited me against Job or something along those lines, right? Yeah. So actually, like, we would like to take the easy out and say, well, God's got a degree of separation here. Satan did this. But actually, God is the one who says, no, I did this.
Yes, he's taking responsibility.
He makes the fact that he's complicit, I suppose. I don't know if that's the right word, but it might be here. Yeah. You know, he makes the fact that he's something like complicit in Job's suffering very clear. And we just skip over that and say, no, see, it was Satan. But the book of Job is highlighting, is magnifying. No, it wasn't that simple.
Well, he's like, have you considered my servant Job? I'm like, I really hate that line. I'm like, we'll just cross that one out.
If I'm Job, I'm like, don't bring me into this, God. I know. Like, why did you do
I'm like,
that?
Out of all people.
Like but how do you traverse that? Like, how do you traverse that hard question?
Yeah. I mean, when we were talking on the phone last week about it, I mentioned, and after we got off the phone, I was like, that was a bold thing to say. I don't know if I fully agree with that, but I was like, I'm really comfortable in the mystery of Job. Yes. And I've grown in that, and that's not something that don't have a million questions still on and don't have things that even just kind of rereading and kind of prepping for today of like, there is so much that is confusing about this and doesn't make sense. I was listening to John Walton, who's a Old Testament professor, and he does a lot of great work on Job that has been really helpful for me. And he kind of thinks that it's not Satan and that it's like an angel that is called a challenger, and some just interesting things that he's just got to, I don't know that I agree with him, but it's a fascinating point to kind of just listen to his side on that. And he's like, it was heavenly kind of office, not even a courtroom. Like, hey, what are you working on at work today? Like a little 5-minute stand up that God was like, where were you? But then you get to this question of, have you considered my servant Job? And as much as I think the main question people ask in Job is, why do bad things happen to good people? It seems like the real question that's being asked is, why do good things happen to good people? Like that seems like what the challenger is asking in that moment, or the Satan or Satan or whoever we want to call it.
That's good.
Of man, why do good things happen to good people? And so trying to not, when I have conversations on Job or just in my own wrestling of it, to not shy away from that of like, God really did say that. And I don't get that. And that is bothering to me and perplexing. And if I wasn't going to be, so in awe the moment I get to heaven, I would want to ask him about that.
Yes.
But really reading that in the context too of there's just so much nuance here in this that I don't know. And in some ways, not to wrap a Christian bow around it, but that is one of my main takeaways of Job is, man, God is not an equation, and suffering does not work in an equation. As much as, the retribution principle and all that of, man, as much as I want it to be, you did a good thing for Alec and he gives you a high five and says, go home 5 minutes early or whatever. You probably don't have authority to do that. But, it's those types of things. If we want it to be this back and forth and that how friendships work and relationships work and how us and God work. And it doesn't. And we see that so clearly of Job lived this righteous life, right? And it gets to, have you considered my servant Job? And it makes no sense. And really just being like, okay, God, you operate on wisdom. You don't operate on justice. You are justice. But you operate on wisdom first and foremost. And my justice, my understanding of justice is not your justice. And so some of this conversation here that I don't know what you're trying to teach me here, and I don't know what the wisdom I can pull from this, is just reminding me in those moments of, especially in suffering, when it makes no sense and we feel the urge to be like, I've done nothing wrong, right? Like how can that be? Or I've done everything right. How can this not be? I love Elizabeth Elliot. She describes suffering of, it's this idea of you have what you don't want or you don't have what you want. And so it's the both and, right? It's not just, man, I got cancer and now I'm suffering. It's what if you really long for something and you don't have it? And so in those moments, in both of those sides of suffering, is God does not operate in an equation like I want him to, and that makes me feel uncomfortable. He operates in wisdom. And so I don't know why he says, will you consider my servant Job? Is really kind of how I...
Well, and I think it's that, we've talked about this a little bit, it's like the half theology thing. So
that was so good.
So the friends, when they show up to Job, they have this really neat packaged theology of God is good, and if you do good things, he rewards you, and bad things happen to you, Job, so that means you must have done something bad. And they have no space for any sort of question about God. They have no space for mystery about God. They don't discuss the enemy. They have no space for like a spiritual enemy. They have no space for free will of man causing this. And there are so many things that Job does not allow himself to get sucked into these sort of easy answers to the questions. He's like, no, that doesn't make sense. I know theologically you're airtight, but that doesn't make any sense. And I think that it's so much of what we go through in our relationship with God. It's very much this, I'm trying to boil this down into, if I give you this, God, then you're going to give me that back, right? If I put in enough hours of prayer, then you're going to do this for me, know? And Job is blowing that whole thing up. And I the only way I could figure out how to summarize, even when God shows up and says, did you do this? And do you understand that? For me, I use the example of like my kids, especially little kids. I always get asked, Daddy, why are you going to work? Because they just don't have any spot for that in their thought process. They're just like, I don't understand. You love me and you care about me, and yet you leave me most of the day. Why do you do that? And you try to explain it to them, but you realize like, I can't. Like, you're just going to have to trust me. I need to go to work to make money, and I also gain something from it, and I feel like that a little bit with God. He's going, look, I could go point by point and answer some of these questions, but it still really wouldn't make sense to you. Like, I see this whole thing playing out from beginning to end, and you've got to trust me. There is some purpose in this. And that was Job. That was the big question at the end of the series. I'm like, why did Job have to go through this? That's the question we always ask, but clearly, like, we're talking about it. There's something that Job had no idea how many generations would be impacted by this story.
Yeah.
No clue. There's no way he could possibly know that. He didn't understand, and he didn't know this spiritual realm was watching what he did too. And there's all these things in play, and you just get the sense from God of going, look, it would take me 1,000 years to explain to you all the reasons why this needs to happen, but just trust me, this is what needs to happen.
And I love that, like, because I think the place some people go with these exact train of thought, which is where neither of you are going with it at all, and certainly I don't think we're the author of the book of Job, who clearly was a genius, whoever that individual was, nor where Job is going, nor I think where God is going in the pages. Nobody here is going to the place that Christians sometimes go of like, well, we don't know, but that's okay. We'll just close our eyes and be content with it. Because this book is inviting us deeper. It's inviting us to wrestle. It's inviting
wrestling.
us. Job is commended for his wrestling, for his questioning, for his curiosity. God's answers or responses, not answers, but his responses at the end, they're simultaneously when God's saying, where were you when this happened? Where were you when this, do you know how this happened? Do you know how I did this? They seem to simultaneously be shutting Job down, but drawing him deeper and spurring on his curiosity. Where are the storehouses of heaven? How did you lay the foundations of it? No, I don't know those things, but man, I got some years left in life. I think I'd like to pursue those questions a little bit. And I think it's Proverbs, it says something to the effect of, it's the glory of God to conceal a matter. It could be Ecclesiastes, I don't remember. The glory of God to conceal a matter, the glory of kings to seek it out. God invites us to pursue the answers
go digging
to these
around.
questions. But then the mystery component is to say, I'm not going to create a clean taxonomy that is oversimplified, that's reductionistic, that's minimal, and that I can wrap my mind around. I'm going to admit the vastness of God's creation, and even more so of God, and just say, well, I understand this component. Job's friends said, I seem to understand that God is a God of justice, and that God rewards righteousness and punishes wickedness. And yet I know that God's bigger than that. Had they just said that, they probably would have been in the right.
Right.
Yes, because they were not wrong, except for the fact that they were reductionistic, that they were
and they were leaving things out. And that's what we're talking about. Like, you get to the end of Job, and clearly God's like, I don't sign off on what they're saying. And yet we could quote them, and everyone here would probably be like, that seems
I've probably said those things to friends and hurting or had, I'm like, oh gosh. Like, but it's, to your point, as much as I want to just say, oh, Job, it's confusing and whatever, it's fine. That's also so impractical when we're suffering, And so, like, I can't do that if I'm in the midst of suffering. If either of you are, I don't, it's like if a friend is, you can't do that either. And so there's not an option for me to just say, oh, Job, it's confusing. We'll figure it out later. Like, I can't, for my own suffering, for the world's suffering, for friends' suffering. There's a part of that I have to and I want to know more. But there is so much, what you're saying about the friends of, man, if they would have had an ounce of humility and an ounce of like, I feel like the longer I walk with Jesus, the less I know sometimes of like, wow, I'm so confused and you are so much bigger. I'm so sorry I ever thought you were somewhat figure outable, But just that posture of what we probably all would have wanted the friends to say, or friends to us, of, hey, this is my best guess at it, or this is my best prayer. I also, like, I'm not God, and so I don't know. And that may be the posture toward Job, the book, and the posture toward suffering.
Is that the practical outpouring in terms of, for you, what you see as like spiritual formation? What do we learn from the book of Job,
Yeah, that's a good question. I think definitely that posture of, we're not going to grasp Job. I don't think I certainly am not smart enough to grasp Job, and I don't think there's a lot of people or certain people out there who have a better grasp on it. But just that humility piece of, man, there is a mystery in suffering that we just don't get, and God does not work in an equation that I can figure out. And so some of that is kind of the baseline for the practical nature of it, you know, of man, we're not lamenting so that God gives us something back. That's not how this works. And we are not worshiping, blessed be the name of the Lord, you give and take away, so that God would be like, oh, great, thanks so much.
Yeah.
Here's all the children back that you lost, and
Yes,
here's all the
exactly.
this. Like, it is not an equation that way. But yeah, I think there are some nuggets to pull from of particularly the lament piece and the worship piece. But really that, like, what are we doing just day in and day out that forms us, and that, you know, that John Ortberg language of training, not trying. And so how are we training in our faith, not trying? Because trying's not going to get us anywhere. And if I train in this and have a framework for it, man, that's going to get me, Lord willing, to when suffering comes, whether it's small or big, or in my life or friends, that I'm going to be able to pull on that muscle memory, imperfect and messy, but there, at least it like exists there.
Well, I love what you said about, you know, Job not just being, why do bad things happen to good people, but why do good things happen to good people, you know? And I think that is more of the practicality, even before trauma or something happens. It's like Job is speaking against that too. Like if you don't have a theology for undeserved suffering, you're going to have a really hard time for undeserved blessing.
That's a great point.
So Job is that undeserved blessing. And we like to say, oh, because he was so good, he had all these things. And God is just removing that immediately, going, no, that's not.
We also don't know.
We don't know,
like, it's interesting that Job 1 doesn't start at the beginning of Job's life. Like, we don't get to track with his story of, wow, he actually did live a perfect life, and he did sacrifice. Like, we don't know.
But I think the temptation is you see the end, and you go, oh, the restoration means he earns some blessing back. Yeah. But again, it's like this, if he didn't deserve the suffering, he didn't deserve the blessing either. Yeah. And I think for us, it is that... I think it really is a warning against legalism in the sense that we really like to say, if you give God this, then he gives you that all the time.
So much
and I
cleaner
hear that
way.
language. Sometimes I've become more sensitive to that lately. Like people going, well, if you just fast enough and if you just pray enough and have you read this book? And it just feels very much like if you just keep checking these boxes, then God's going to wake up and go, oh, you know what? You got my attention now. I'm going to do something. And that is not our relationship with God. It's very much this give and take, this hearing. And the lament that Job has is the celebration that we have. He doesn't know how to approach God because he has no way to. It's that gap for Jesus in there. But we can approach God. How bold is that? How beautiful is that? And so I think for us, you would think that maybe that solves the wrestling, but it doesn't. You know, the Holy Spirit for me, and I don't know for you guys, I'm like, why is this happening? I often hear crickets when it comes to that, you know. Yeah. And then later on, I go, oh, I guess that makes sense, you know. But it's that relationship, that give and take. You know?
I love, and you just touched on it a little bit in your last message, wrapping up this series. But on that note, like with, you know, the blessing that he gets afterwards, like, again, it's like so much of the book of Job. If you just read it quickly and at a glance, or don't pay attention, or, you know, a big, you know, pet peeve of mine too is if you read it one chapter at a time over the course of 2 months, you know, like if you're just reading it in a shallow way, you get to the end and you think, great, everything's like tidy, nice, neat little bow on it. But all you have to do is think for 5 seconds and say, well, who has lost a child and then found themselves pregnant in the future and thought, great, everything's I got to do it.
Point.
You don't even do that with a puppy. You know what I mean? You replace the puppy, but you don't say we replaced the puppy. You know,
Your kids, here's the replacement.
It's a tragedy. And I don't remember what the verse was, maybe you, but it stuck out to me. You highlighted it of like, and then he was continuing in the
at the end his family comes to him. It says he was restored. He had more kids and his business was restored. And it said his family came and they comforted him. Yeah. And I thought this proves right here that this is not the end of Job is not a replacement of what he lost.
I
because
thought that was so good.
I'm a father. If I lost my kids and then I get 3 more kids, it's not like, oh, this replaces Toby. You know, like no, like you will
makes
never
you feel
stop.
sick to even joke about it.
Exactly. It's one of those things where you go, no, there's no replacing children. Maybe replacing your business, but I feel like the kids piece is that one that you're like, that can't be replaced no matter what. So the restoration of Job is not a replacement. It's something different. And you feel this depth to him. Like he's still lamenting. Like God shows up and wonderful and powerful, and the storm is there, and it gets his attention, and he goes, I understand a little bit more now. And that was one thing for me. I thought a lot of our questions, as soon as the presence of God shows up, we go, okay, I have fewer questions right now because I'm starting to see how powerful you are. And Job has that. But by no means does that remove the pain of what he lost. Yeah. And up until the very end of Job, he's like, he's lamenting still.
Yeah.
You know?
And you imagine, you just know the reality of being a human, right? Like, that was the rest of his life.
Yeah.
He had, 7 kids, and he lost them? Like, he didn't get over that. You know what I mean? Like, he may have found a peace in it. He may have moved forward. I'm sure he wasn't in a hole the rest of his life. Yeah. But I'm sure on his deathbed, he was thinking, finally, I get to go see my kids again. You know, I'm sure it still stung up until that moment. And it's that thought of like, somehow, like, you know, you can't pay for tragedy. You can't really make it right. And I think one of the key passages of Scripture, actually, this is one of the things we didn't get into at all in this, that actually begins to illuminate, that actually begins to give us some of the answers that Job intentionally withholds from us, is the story of Lazarus. Actually, Luke Parker, who used to be a pastor here, was a guy who I went years ago when I taught through the book of Job. I went and had dinner with him one night, and he was sharing this, and he's the one who brought this to my attention. But the story of Lazarus, and particularly Jesus' interactions with Martha the morning before the resurrection, I think illuminates a lot, right? Because we look at the story of Job, and we look at what we just talked about, like, can you replace the kids? No, you can't. Can you, like, I had a horrible event happened, but then I went to Disneyland.
Yes.
Like, it doesn't work that way. It doesn't weigh them out like that. And I think that's because you and I have only experienced healing, but we haven't experienced resurrection, right? So in the story of Lazarus, right, Jesus is hanging out, he's there with everybody. Lazarus is sick. He leaves town to go elsewhere. And while he's gone, Lazarus dies. Jesus comes back into town, and we see we get a glimpse of this really emotionally fraught interaction between Martha and Jesus, right? Where he sees her before they go to the tomb or whatever, and they're having a conversation. He has a similar interaction with Mary as well, and she says this to Jesus. She says, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." And you can feel in that, like, if you just put yourself emotionally, imagine that room, you know that she's got to be saying like 3 or 4 things in that one sentence, right? She's saying on one hand, like, it's a profession of faith in his goodness and his power, right? If you had been here, I know he would be alive. But also it's grief.
Yeah.
If you had been here, but he's dead, you know, like that
and you
the swirling
here.
that we do after
Here.
And then that's the third one, right, is it's an accusation perhaps. If you had been here, he would be alive, right? And that's all the things we do in grief, right? The swirling and the accusing and all, you know, and so she's wrestling with, how are you good? And so then what does he do? He gives her what, to her, I'm assuming, I could be wrong, I'm making assumptions of her emotional state, but I know human beings and my own heart, and I think it's a safe assumption. He gives her what probably felt like that cheap little Christian answer. Well, you know that he will rise again. And she says, yeah, in the last days, sure, I know. I mean, he's basically saying what you hear at a funeral. Well, it's okay, your wife's in heaven now, and she's happy.
You'll see him again.
And you're thinking, screw you, she's dead. I would like to join her. Like, I feel miserable. You know, I get it. I believe that there's heaven, but that means nothing to me. It's so far away. But then what happens? Then they go to the tomb. Jesus calls him out, you know, and you imagine there's some dancing and some partying. And now how does Martha feel? Hours later, all the grief, all the hurt, all the frustration, all the accusation, it's not disappeared. It's not gone. And yet somehow all those are fuel to realize that Jesus is so much better, so much stronger, so much more than he was before, that somehow her brother's pain and death and that tragedy has actually, it's not brought Jesus back to zero again. It's not leveled him out. It's brought him way above where she realized he was before. And you and I are in a microcosm of that now when we encounter suffering. When we see the unspeakable things, the evil that you've gone through, that you've encountered, that is you don't talk about it. We don't even say those words. You know, they're real evils in the world, not the hypotheticals, the ones that you actually felt, experienced, witnessed. When you encounter those, we think, at best, we would console ourselves and say, well, maybe the Lord will use that tragedy, that grief, that horrible evil that was done to you so that you can help other people recover. But you're like, but I still have this massive scar over my chest, and it's not really better, and I don't wish that had happened, and I'm so grateful that the Lord has redeemed it in some way to make it useful. But it should not have happened. That doesn't make it better. That makes it better, but it doesn't make it where it should be. Because that's just healing. And healing is, and it may be even miraculous healing. But I think that there's a difference. But see, Lazarus wasn't healed. He was resurrected. Right? His life didn't come back. He didn't come back with a limp like so many other people who might have experienced some healing. He came back to life. And I think you and I, in the best of it, have only likely witnessed the healing that God offers, which is beautiful and wonderful and powerful, but doesn't quite get us there, does it? You know, we're still like -1 or 2 even with the best healing. But
I think it's that practicality too of like what you were saying, where one of the chapters I love in this book is what not to say to a suffering believer. And
everyone should read that.
Yes, I think practically
like required reading.
Yes, practically you step out of Job and you go, well, his comforters clearly were not comforting, you know, and they came with their nice, tight theological answers. And I think what we're invited into as believers when somebody is suffering next to us is to cry with those who are crying. And some of the best pastoral advice I'd ever gotten was a pastor a long time ago when I first started working at a church. He said, don't try to give somebody cheap answers when they're going through suffering. He said, just be with them. And he told a story of somebody in the congregation whose son died really tragically. And he said, and I just sat with him and I cried. And I didn't try to go, you know, the Lord's going to use this for good later. And those are the kind of things, they do come eventually in our processing. But as Christians, when somebody is standing next to us and they're suffering, we have to resist the urge to give them all the platitudes and easy answers. Because God never does that. He just never does that. And we have to learn how to have that empathy and connection with people. That, I think, is something really practical out of the book of Job, that when we're going through it, don't say to a suffering believer like, hey, one day you'll see him in heaven. They don't want to hear that right now. Maybe at some point they'll be able to receive that because it is true and it is comforting in its right time. But it is not the time for it right now. Right now is the time. And I think the best thing that Job's friends ever did for him is they sat in silence with him for 2 days. I was like, good start there. Like you guys started really strong. And then you opened your mouth and it got real wonky there.
And all the more reason for us to lock that truth into our heart so that in that moment, it's at least on the back burner of our heart when we're grieving and we know that the resurrection is coming. And there is more. When we say resurrection, you know, like it's not just Jesus' resurrection. That's the first fruits. Like that's just the first. Like we're waiting for resurrection of everyone, you know, and we're waiting for something bigger than the healing we've ever experienced. And so to lock that truth into our hearts and to say, for all the healing I've seen God do, I know that I've only tasted and there's more. There's resurrect that even is going to make all of the suffering, like it's going to reverse it and multiply it and make him so much better. But like we need to be diligent as disciples to lock that into our hearts so that it's there when we're grieving.
Muscle memory.
Exactly. Like we were talking, because then it's just not. It's going to be water off a duck's back in the moment of suffering if someone tries to share that truth with us. I'd love to hear because we've talked about it. You've alluded to it a little bit, but you have some really practical thoughts and experiences, and I think I'm just, it's new for me, but on lament, I'd love to hear, kind of the practical and kind of the thoughts and kind of, what you have on lament, because I think we're kind of there.
I mean, it fits right into what we're talking about. I heard someone say the phrase of what we can kind of pull from Job and how to use that when we're talking to someone is empathetic and eschatological. And that is kind of the framework. Doesn't mean we say either of, doesn't mean we give our thoughts about heaven and, the hope of the future. That may just be kept quiet in our minds. But maybe there's a place for that too. And I think that's what lament does so beautifully. And that's what Job does really beautifully, is he has his eyes toward heaven really clearly, but he's also really aware of his situation, and he's not shying away from it. He's not being, oh, it'll be fine. And lament too is really honest about where we're at, and it's not rushing toward what I think one of the dangers of Job is when we look at the last chapter of, oh, everything was restored. And that to me is such a temptation in my own life and in friends' lives of when suffering goes bad, whether it's suffering of something you have that you don't want or suffering that you don't have what you want, that God is ultimately going to give it, right? Like you get divorced, you're going to get remarried, or like you get cancer, God's going to heal it, or you don't have something that you want, pray enough. Like that's not the message of Job. Yeah. It's part of it. And so what I feel like it does is it just gives us something to hold, and it gives something to grab in a season when suffering is so chaotic and it feels like the world is turned upside down. And so, how I've been taught and how I love about lament is that there's 5 structures of it. And so when I teach on it, I, particularly for college students who maybe have never heard of it, or in anti-trafficking work that I've done that I know we've talked about, in a topic that is really hard and confusing and messy for people to wrap their minds around, there's 5 kind of structures that we can pull from lament Psalms particularly. And also, we know lament is all over scripture. But when we look at the Psalms, there's 5 pieces of it. And so I kind of walk them through those 5 pieces, and I usually work off Psalm 13 because it's a pretty clean example of that. And it works similar to the Lord's Prayer of we don't have to follow that exact structure every time we pray it, but it's a great model. And it's a great starting place when we're kind of learning about it. And so it starts with an opening address. That's point 1. And what I love about that is it's not me talking to you about what's bothering me about God. It's me going straight to God, right? It's Father, God, it's, are you there? Like you're going directly to him. And so it's like, who are you writing the letter to? And so as much as I want to blow past, opening address, sure, we're saying, dear God, actually really matters in suffering, because there's so much I want to say about God that maybe I don't feel comfortable telling him, or I'm bugged by him. And so I'm going to gossip, right? I'm going to just, but in a gentler way because we're suffering, you know, I'm going to talk to you about it instead of going to God. And so some of the other pieces is there's a petition. And so what do you need? There's a complaint of what's wrong here, like really specifically say, this is what's wrong. You know, Job is, you took my family, you took my health. Spell it out what's there. And then you're declaring your trust. So the last 2 points, I think, are what make lament uniquely Christian, because there's a lot of faiths and there's a lot of religions and there's a lot of frameworks and worldviews out there that say, be honest, right? Like, I think that's some of the good movement of the self-care movement and kind of everything that's happened culturally in the last couple of years is be honest about your story. And that's huge and that's good. And I'm all for that. But I think what makes lament uniquely Christian is kind of similar to Job as the bookends. It starts opening address, and in the last 2 sections, 4 is you're declaring your trust. You're saying, God, even though all these things, I trust you. Or I trust you a little bit, help me to trust you more. And then point number 5 is a vow of praise. And that is unique to, I mean, it like makes me teary. That's only can come through the Holy Spirit in us in practice, and it's messy, and maybe you get to points 1, 2, and 3, and you're like, I can't get to the vow of praise today. Okay, good. You're honest about it, but come back. And so really just giving people that framework. And I give them usually a card front and back that has those 5 points and then Psalm 13 on the other side, and say, and when I teach a workshop on it, I just say, okay, we're going to take the next 20 minutes. And like, if you don't have anything suffering, pull up the news app. I guarantee you can find something. Or like text 5 of your friends and be like, what's going on? And also if you don't know, maybe we can add that element to your community. It's like sharing what's going on. But that has been personally lament for me, but also on behalf of my friends of the times when I don't know what to say, not lamenting in front of them, but if I'm saying, hey, I'll pray for you about what's going on, maybe write a lament, right? When I don't know, it's actually me going, it feels like I'm going to war on behalf of you to God, which feels so helpful in a situation where you feel helpless. And so I love lament, and it just seems so practical when suffering is so impractical.
Wow.
Well, and I love what you said, empathy and eschatology. And I would say that this is probably something I didn't get a chance to touch on that I wish I could. There's a reason in pretty much every epistle, there's maybe a couple that it's not the case. Paul and Peter, I mean, they're all talking about that day when Jesus comes back. They all are like unpacking that. Thessalonians is one of those where it's like he was probably at in Thessalonica for like 3 weeks, maybe 4 at the absolute most. And he planted a church. And in the book of Thessalonians, when he's talking about the Antichrist, he goes, remember, we talked a lot about this. And I'm like, in 3 weeks of discipleship, you need eschatology, you know?
Impressive.
And but there's something about that it is the hope that we have. Though sometimes I feel like if it's communicated at the wrong time in the wrong way, it comes out cheap. But if it comes out at the appropriate time, and it's the thing that, honestly, before we go into suffering, this is the building that foundation of muscle memory. We do know that there is a day when everything gets righted. You know, all the wrongs are righted. When everything sad becomes untrue, that David always quotes. And for whatever reason, it's better having once been broken. So that's the trust that we have in that eschatological backdrop of, yes, one day it will be set right. And it can be a cheap answer if it's given in a cheap way, but it can't be thrown out. Like it's one of those things that it's like we tend to throw that out because it's so mysterious, but we need to engage in that. And Job is creating that space where, again, what are we hungry for? We're hungry for all of this to be set right. As much as we can wrestle with this and we know that God is working something, you know, all the bad things for good, we are built for this hope that one day it will all be set right. And it will be. And we have to, as believers, remind each other of that all the time. You know?
Well, and I think it's so vital that, I mean, I do. I agree. I love that mix, and it's so important that we work on it. And again, it's back on that half theology is bad theology point, which actually was one of the other main things that we kind of looked at as a filter in the series was like, well, what's, you know, if we want people to gain that muscle memory, the other thing we want to do is we want to equip people to deal with half theologies that they are probably holding. Because even again, all the way back to that conversation we were having on deconstruction, right? Like, what's the big danger that tends to happen in deconstruction is as people deconstruct, they find a half theology that seems to them to be inextricably linked to what actually happens to be truth. And so since they don't know how to pull them apart, they just throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? You know, so they feel, you know, for example, I think an easy one to poke at would be like prosperity gospel, right? Which people who are subscribed to prosperity gospel, I believe, can have a real and thriving relationship with the Lord and can know the Lord and can share the gospel. And I'm not saying that it is inherently and completely corrupt or anything like that. I'm not saying that if you disagree with me on prosperity gospel, you don't know Jesus. Yet I think it's a half theology, right? This assertion that God always wants the good thing for every moment, every minute. And so if the good thing isn't happening, if you're not getting the raise, if you're not getting the blessing, if grandma didn't get healed of cancer, then the fault lies with you, or then something is in the way of what God's wanting to do in that moment. And it actually doesn't hold a very full understanding of eschatology, of the resurrection of God making a new heaven and a new earth and all that. And it doesn't hold room for suffering, that actually God says, suffering can happen in this moment. And yes, there will be a resurrection later, but also there will be suffering for eternity too for some. It doesn't hold those things very, very well. And so the problem is if you're deconstructing and you say, well, I was told that, you know, that God always wants the good thing all the time right now, and that if there's something wrong, then it's me or something's in the way. And yet here I am, like Job, going through pain, going through suffering. I'm pretty confident that I can't trace it to something I've done wrong or this isn't deserved. So this must be a lie. The whole thing's a lie. Let me just so there must be no God then. There, or if there is a God, I need to remake him in my image, because clearly my understanding of him is wrong. And it's like, well, if you could only just say, I've had a half theology. God is good. God does want good things. God does, want righteousness and thriving. And yet there really is. There's a bigger, there's a mystery, there's a suffering. And, I think that's so important. We tried to hit that a little bit, and I hit that a bit in my message, which we called Half Theology is Bad Theology. And I think for anybody who wants to go deeper into that, I mentioned the book in my message, but Nancy Pearcey, who is an author that I've come to just think very highly of, she has a book called Finding Truth that dives very deep into that very question of how do we figure out, and particularly she's looking from an outside the church perspective of ideologies that are wrong and unhelpful, but I think it very much applies to half theologies within the church. To heresy is a word we've thrown around, and not to be like get out of here, burn you at the stake, but just the literal definition of a thing that is wrong and can lead to you walking away from the Lord. But she talks about reductionism and says any worldview that's reductionistic, which is to say any worldview that is built on just one or two components of creation or theology or whatever. Ultimately, it's not a big enough foundation to build the whole house. And so something's going to stick outside of the box, and then you're going to have to lop it off or ignore it, or try to shove it in. That's what Job's friends do. That's what all of the destructive ideologies that we see in the world do. The ones that get the most traction tend to be a little bit more complex and a little bit more useful. But somewhere, if they're reductionist, if they're not built on God, and she would say that's the only foundation that works, is build your worldview on an eternal God who's transcendent, because that is a foundation upon which you can continue to build. So when you find something that sticks outside of the box, well, no big deal. I built my box on God, and I realized I just need to build another chamber to my box, and I got the foundation for it already because God is transcendent and he's big enough.
We have to resist that temptation to build our own foundation. And I think that's what, even what you're saying, there's a legalism. We're always tempted by legalism somewhere. And I think we think it's only maybe on the Reformed side, but I think there's a charismatic sort of version of that too. I think wherever we're trying to say, reduce down God into just one or two things, then we've got a problem. And I think we have that tendency, all of us. We're trying to build a foundation, especially when we're going through a hard time. We're like, what can I stand on? Well, I could stand on this and that, but that doesn't feel like enough to just stand on the fact that God's in charge. So we start building some other little janky foundation over here that's just not going to withstand the test of time. And I think we're all tempted to do that. Well,
it's the Sermon on the Mount. He ends with, "He who hears my words and practices them will have a house well built, a house that is built on the rock." And so and obviously the Sermon on the Mount is hard to conceptualize sometimes. That is a lot that you're asking, and seems like I can't do that. But it's one of those things of, man, he really knows if you practice these things and you do these things and you don't just hear my word. That's why I'm so passionate about spiritual practices and really what does it mean to not just profess Christianity but practice it. So then we are not the ones building the foundation. We're practicing it, and I don't know, whatever analogy you want to use of God's the architect and we're the builder or whatever you want to go with, right? But he's given us those ways in suffering and out of suffering, and not that we're building a firm house out of suffering for this doomsday mindset, right? Of oh shoot, I got to get prepared, get my tornado kit ready, or all that. It's not that. And I imagine PTSD plays into that and different things where it could feel that way, but really for good and for bad, there is a model that God has invited us into of actually how to live a life well lived that is life-giving in the midst of good, and is helping us survive and not thrive, but survive in the midst of suffering.
It's good.
In the emails that we were sent, not just kind of preparation, kind of greasing the wheels for the conversation, you have a bullet point that I'm dying to hear your thoughts on, because it's a great question. You simply just said, why didn't the story ended in chapter 1 when Satan's accusation was proven wrong.
Yeah.
I very much want to know what.
I have always wondered that because, right, you
Yes.
get in the beginning of chapter 1 is the question between the challenger, the adversary, whoever is, okay, does God like serve you because, or does Job serve you, God, for the things that you give him, right?
Yeah.
Like that's the question. And God's like, through all the different dialogue of, okay, here you go. You can do this, but just don't touch his body or don't touch this.
Yeah.
And right away, the first suffering that Job encounters, his response is he tore his robe and he worshiped. And he said, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. That answers the question right there.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
his whole theory is disproven like 10 verses in. And I'm like,
Yeah.
that's the end. That should be the end of the story. Like it just is always, and I get why I don't fully get, but it's a beautiful book and I'm so glad we have it. But it seems interesting that point right at the beginning that it continues and it makes you be like, God, why? Like what else did you need to show there? So I don't know if that's ever stood out to either
and I think
of you.
that, and what you were talking about in terms of the stages of lament and all of that, it's like you see Job go through that. Because
Totally.
again, when tragedy first strikes, it feels like maybe even it's just adrenaline speaking, like, blessed be the name of the Lord. Obviously, that's his first response. There's that muscle memory. It's awesome. But I think as that tragedy sat with him longer, I mean, going through a hard day is hard. Going through a hard year is different, you know, or going through loss of a child is different. So you see his whole process, and I love the way that you were kind of laying that out. But it's like that honesty and things that we're picking up in science, right, when it comes to mental health and things like that, where we're going, you've got to confront whatever it is that's in your way. And in some ways, that's beautiful and that's absolutely true. And you look at it, and Job is confronting it. He's going, God, you took my kids, and I'm mad. Even if I did something wrong, this just seems out of balance in terms of what your response should be. I don't, you know. And even at some point, he's going, maybe the sins of my youth. Maybe he's saying, maybe there was this thing that happened, you know. And that's why I make such a big point out of the beginning when it says Job was blameless. Job never claims to have moral perfection in the same way we would use the word blameless, you know. But Job was this deeply authentic guy. And that's the thing that comes out in the beginning. It's like he very much values his relationship with God. But you see throughout the whole course of it, it's that wrestling again. Maybe worship was his first response, but what's his second response and third response? And then what's his friend's response? And it's the complication of the whole process of what we go through when we go through loss. But what you see at the end is it feels like there's this depth that's built in Job where he trusts God. You know, when God first responds, I love Job's like, I am not going to say anything. He's like, I'm going to put my hand over my mouth. Like he's literally like, just tell me more about you because you seem to be answering some of these questions without answering them, you know. And so there seems like there's this depth and maturity that's built in Job over that time. But I feel like all those chapters are a little bit reminiscent of like what you would go through in tragedy. It's like your first response, I'm going to bless the name of the Lord. But what do you do a month later? What do you do 6 months later? What do you do at that year anniversary when you realize you're not celebrating that birthday anymore? Like, what is that process? And it's messy. And Job's very honest with his friends, and he goes through this whole thing. And I think it really does represent a lot of what we go through in loss, you know?
Yeah.
So
That's good.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, that'll haunt my brain for a little while. But I mean, because I have my initial thoughts, but I also,
Sorry,
I'm
not
also
sorry.
like, I don't want to give my initial thoughts because it's the book of Job, you know, like your initial thoughts are usually the wrong, you know, like I mean, I feel like, you know, maybe, you know, there's like, I think of, we have someone on our staff who does this really well, Tammy, and especially when she's paired up with someone who talks too much like me, you know, when she was my direct oversight for a while, we'd have weekly meetings and we'd come in there and she would just, hey, how's it going? And I'd talk a little bit and then I'd like wait for her to like say a thing or and then she'd just sit. And I, okay, well, I'll share more on that, you know? And I would just keep going, you know, and she'd wait until the third or fourth time when I squeezed everything I could out of the question that she had asked or whatever. You know, and she was able to get me to, I felt as someone who talks a lot, I felt really honored that she would listen to me. Not everybody wants to listen to me. But B, like she helped me process through things by by forcing me to squeeze a little bit more to get those last couple drops out. And so I wonder if there's some element of that. It's like, well, here's Job's response, but then God's like, but now this period between, the introduction and when God shows up, perhaps, and the frustration and the wrestling with his friends, and then, the mysterious Elihu comes on at the end. It's like, maybe a lot of that is God just saying, all right, Job, just keep squeezing. You know what I mean? Like, because he does. He comes to the realization of his Redeemer in that space.
God is very patient in the whole thing. It's like he lets it sit for quite a while. And he lets a lot of people share their 2 cents. He doesn't feel the need to come charging in there and set them straight. He lets them process that whole thing out.
Yeah.
And I did feel like, it's like you get in an argument with that friend, and maybe you're talking about politics or whatever, and you're arguing and you're not agreeing, and then at some point you come full circle and you're like, and we're talking about the same thing again, and we still don't agree on it, and it feels like God waited until he came full circle, and then he's like, all right, let me give you a little perspective here, And that phrase toward the end of Job for me, it was, I just started to have this realization, and right before that last sermon, it was real crazy season for me with David stepping out, and we were in Alaska together, and I was flying back from Alaska the day before I was preaching this message, and I was like, gosh, I'm just tired. I feel like I can't see straight. I'm like trying to figure out what to say, and I had this realization while I was flying that God seems a lot more interested in giving us perspective than he does giving us answers. And that's at the end of Job, that's what it is. It's like, you've asked all your questions, Job. Are you done? Are you done coming back around the same thing over and over? Let me give you a little bit of a different perspective. And it seems harsh. I mean, God definitely comes in and he doesn't go, how are you feeling, Job? He's like, he knows now. He's like, and God knew anyway. But he comes in and goes, let me give you this perspective. And it's like a splash of cold water on Job's face where he goes, oh, geez, I have been wallowing over here, and now you're giving me this refreshing new perspective. And I go, wow, I have no idea. I had no idea you are who you are.
And I think to me, one of the things I see in God's response to Job is really just is like a very almost like visceral engagement with the reality that trusting God is reasonable. God, again, I think it's easy to read that just like any text message, we know not to have, heated conversations over text message because the tone
most of us do. Most
some
do.
people don't. Sometimes we don't. And I may or may not have been guilty of doing that every here and there, but you know not to do it because you lose the tone, and so we have this problem a little bit in God's response. And I'm sure that it's not like you said, not a gentle, kind, tender tone, although I'm sure there is some of that in there. But I think, to me, I see a lot of like, Job, it is so reasonable to trust me. Like that sliver of you that clung to me is right, and let me speak to the wrestling you're having with not trusting me. And again, it's still at the tail end of a book that invites us to dig, to dive, to wrestle, to question, to think, to reason things out. That presents us with challenging questions. It's not God just shutting up the questioning. That's absolutely not the case, because Job's friends did that, and God reprimands them and says, Job spoke rightly of you. But it's God inviting that and saying, hey, but trusting me, it's a really reasonable thing to do. And I think that we can, you alluded to that a little bit with your kids, in going to work. And I think of, again, like an airplane, like if you're on an airplane and there's turbulence and the turbulence really bad, and I can remember a couple flights, where it's really bad, or even one where it was like the landing was like, I think we almost died there, What would have the worst thing I could have done would have been to stand up in arrogance and say, I'm going to the front of the plane and I'm telling this guy to move over. I'm going to land the plane. Like that would be so foolish, like
and you wouldn't be able to help. Like there's nothing you could do in that moment, actually. Like you don't know how to fly a plane.
The most reasonable thing I can do is trust my life to that pilot who simply knows what I don't know. Does that mean that I couldn't possibly someday learn to fly a plane?
Sure.
I could do that. Doesn't mean I don't understand the way that airfoils work. But I need to trust God in this moment.
Yeah.
And when we land, perhaps I know the pilot and I say, hey, what happened?
Sure.
Why did it feel like we were going to die
Can we not
there?
do that next time?
It's like God's the pilot, though, and he's bringing you in. He's like, let me explain to you the altimeter and how that works. And you go, oh, geez, I had no idea what I didn't know, you know?
Yeah.
And that's like David and I talked about the shock of like Job's response to Leviathan, you know, which we had good debate about, like, is this a Satan figure that he's explaining? Is this an actual creature? I think there's some acceptable debate inside of those questions. But there's something about Leviathan. He explains Leviathan, and Job goes, say no more. I get it. And we're going, really? That's your response to that thing, you know? But it's that same thing. It's like, well, do you want to fly the plane?
Right.
Because I'll explain to you how a few of these things work.
Best of luck with that.
Yes, exactly. And it's pretty overwhelming, you know?
Yeah, I kind of love God's response at the end there. And I think I struggled with it for a while. Like, gosh, that sounds real harsh. And it totally can be, right? It's like if you maybe, like, to use your plane analogy, you like push the little flight attendant button, right? And you're like, quick question, like there's a lot of turbulence here. Are we doing okay? You know? And the flight attendant was like, it could be portrayed as like, you're an idiot, sit down, you're not the pilot, don't be afraid. And you're like, I just asked a simple question. Clearly, like, this is it's not like it's a sunny day.
Yeah.
But I wonder, and based on how Job responds, and I think he said after God, says, do you call lightning and like bring it to your, then they say, hi, here we are. Like, do you see the storehouses of snow? Yeah. He says something along the lines of like, I know that you're in control or something, or I know that you can control all things. And so I wonder how much on our perspective, it seems like God's response was so harsh.
Yeah.
And maybe we would have loved, for him to be like, hey, pal, I'm so sorry. This is a lot. But I wonder, too, if that's actually what Job needed to be reminded of in the moment to calm his fear, right? Of hey, I made snow. Yeah. You didn't. Like, I create lightning and tell it when to strike on a monsoon night in Phoenix, Arizona. Like, I'm the one that does that. And that was actually maybe more of what Job needed in the moment than a hug and a pat on the back. Yeah. Not that he didn't need that, but I just wonder how much
he needed that perspective.
Yeah, I even think maybe a month ago or a couple weeks ago, I was just wrestling through some painful stuff and talking to the Lord about it. And like brushing my teeth one night in the middle of nowhere, I just felt so clearly that the Lord said something in direct response to the stuff I was processing. And it was not a warm fuzzy. It was not a, hey, Cal, so sorry. Yeah. It was kind of a challenge, and it was kind of a intense word, but it was exactly what I needed to feel seen and known by God, and reminded that He's God and I'm not. Yeah. And so it is a helpful reminder as I read Job of, man, God operates on wisdom, and it's not my wisdom. And when we give Him space to speak, although that's a messy thing too, I just wonder how much of it wasn't just our initial reaction of God seems harsh and He's mean and He's not kind during suffering, and that God was the one that said those things. Yeah. Like His friends didn't get the place to say, well, God's in control, and which is a good thing to say, but the Lord actually, like, he
was able to say that.
He was like, that's my line, like, not your line.
Totally. Well, and I think too, one of the perspectives, and part of the reason why I think Leviathan, when he's explaining, David talked about how to train your dragon.
That was fun.
And I remember I sat in a sermon a long time ago, and somebody's like, see, this is why dinosaurs lived the same time as humans. And I'm going, sure, maybe that brings up that sort of debate. But there's this verse at the end of Leviathan when God says He sees something to the effect of like the hearts of all the men kind of thing on the earth. And there's just something that seems kind of otherworldly about Leviathan. And I thought for the season of life that we're in right now, it's like, it's so easy, right now, China's in the news for, saber rattling, and I don't know if it's more than saber rattling. And it's really, really easy to read the news right now and to go, holy crap, like things are bad and they're out of control bad. And it seems like there's nothing we can grasp onto that's giving justice or goodness. Like, it just seems overwhelming. And I think there's a little bit of that with Leviathan. It's like, whether it's the enemy or the work of the enemy or something, there's those seasons, and we've lived in a couple of generations of relative comfort. Mm-hmm. We've hit a new season where things are not comfortable, and we all know, like the apple cart's been upset. We don't know necessarily exactly where everything's going to sift out. We know 2020 was hard. 2021 didn't seem that much better. 2022 has its own challenges. We're like, when is this going to let up? But there's something really beautiful. I feel like the Lord's highlighting this, like when we're overwhelmed by the work of the enemy, when you're overwhelmed by Leviathan, our job is to take a step back and to remember that Leviathan or Satan or the Satan or the adversary is that dog on a leash, and realizing as overwhelming as the evil feels and the work of the enemy is overwhelming, God is even more overwhelming, you know? And it's this simple, and I think that's why Job responded the way he did. It feels like he wants to know, Job is desperate to know, like, is this the end of it? Like, is there no end to what Satan can inflict onto me? And God's going, no, there is an end to that, you know? And I think just looking at humanity, looking at the church, looking like we're feeling rather Job-like right now. We're feeling like, are you going to stop this at any point? Because this feels overwhelming to me. But you see that character of God going, no, you don't understand. Like, I completely see all those things. And yes, it's way bigger than you are. And yes, there's no way you can penetrate the scales of Leviathan. But I can. And I have this under control. And you got to know, I am over this monster, you know, that's over us. So there was that aspect to it that I was really going, again, Job is saying so much. Like, I didn't get to say hardly any of that, but it's like Job is adding so many layers onto our understanding of God that the more I pour into it, the more I get out of it, you know.
And I think it's interesting seeing his response along those lines of feeling like, not like you said, not the like, oh, sweet little Job, let me hold you, you know, like it says something about us too. You know, because God knows us. And I think, again, even just in this moment in our culture where it's like it seems like universally we've realized, oh, we have a problem with our inner life. Yeah. Like it felt like it was boiling for a while, and then COVID hit, and it was like, okay, none of us can pretend that it's not a problem anymore. And it's interesting because it's on the tail end of a few decades, of maybe even a couple generations of a lot of tenderness, a lot of compassion, a lot of trying not to hurt, a lot of trying to not to offend, and what we're realizing that seems to be perhaps one of the the variables that's made it so bad. Yeah. And this word anti-fragile has been coined recently, and I've heard hear a lot of talk about it. This idea of things that actually get stronger when they're faced with adversity. Yeah. You know, and I think I can't remember who the guy was, but I watched him on a podcast who had coined the term, was talking about, particularly about children, you know, and the anti-fragile nature of children, how children need to have, you know, playgrounds with a rusty nail floating around, you know, where they might get scraped on and hopefully not get tetanus. You know, like they need to get,
and they need play without parents over them, and they need this developmentally thing.
An encounter with a bully, you know, and to figure out, oh, okay, that person was so mean to me and said horrible things, and I pulled through. And the difference with children is it's like, you know, we what we're trying to do. Really is, you know, protect from those life scars, but those life scars come when there isn't a place of safety in life, right? So, like, I had a close friend in junior high who got bullied quite a bit, and I encountered, like, it was junior high, you know, who doesn't get get called names, who doesn't have an enemy or a bully or whatever, and I encountered something not quite to the same extent he did. It scarred him for life. For me, it didn't. The difference was, my home was stable, and when he went home, he had an older sibling, and he had a stepfather who yelled at him constantly. You know, so he went home to no stability. No one saying, "Hey, that's okay. What that person said isn't true," and you know, go up to that guy and stand up to him the next day and tell him, "Hey, you need to stop this." You know, like he didn't encounter that. When I went home, you know, I had parents who were obnoxious in how affirming they were. And so there's that, and who also did not overly protect me from adversity. You know, I think there's something that God in his tenderness knows. Sometimes we need a little bit of tough love. It's good, and I think even I was talking the other day about the TV show Alone. Have you guys ever watched that?
Oh yeah.
Oh my gosh,
I love that
it's
show.
so great. It's like
great.
Survivor, but real
But
life.
real.
Oh my
They
gosh.
just take 10 people and they take them to a horrible place in the wilderness, and they drop them off, and they're far away from each other. They never interact. They just have their own camera gear, and they film themselves.
That's terrible.
And they have to outlast everyone else. And
And they never know when other people are leaving.
So it's like
they're
real
just-
life Hunger Games.
Yes,
Yeah, kind of.
basically.
Yeah, pretty much, yeah.
basically.
And,
Without the killing, but yeah.
Sure, yeah.
And I think it was the second or maybe the third season, the guy who won, right? It's absolutely horrible. They seemed for like 8 of the seasons, they put him in Vancouver Island, which is this miserable, wet place where you can't start a fire.
Oh
It's
my
cold.
gosh.
It's up in Canada. It's just
Starts freezing over.
there's
They're like
bears
in the snow
and
at some point. Yeah.
And the guy who won out of the second or third season was a believer. And he's won. He's outlasted everybody. He's emaciated. It's been horrible. Everybody suffers on that show. And he's kind of on his, flying into the sunset moment, the final cut. And I can't remember exactly what he said, but he said one of the things is my worldview as a believer has a lot to do with suffering. And I think that suffering produces some really valuable things. And so I think that was a big part of what brought me to the end, what brought me to win this, was that I saw value in what God was doing in me through the suffering, through the hunger, through the frustration, through the day when my shelter collapsed or whatever, and there's something really valuable to that. And I think that there's a lot of strength if we in the church can learn not to dive unnecessarily into suffering, of course not, but not to avoid suffering and not to turn it off and not to go to Instagram to pretend it's not there and not to protect our kids from, of course, from a certain degree of it, but not to overly protect them from adversity and pain and stretching. And the Bible affirms that, it says that this produces something beautiful in you.
Yeah.
Well, it got to Job he said, my ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Like, gosh, that's my prayer for the smallest bit of suffering that I go through to the biggest, or that my friends, or that would be true. That I would be, not that I am not trusting God, but there would be maybe a deeper trust without floaties on, that it'd be like a new level of trust that, man, like, oh wow, there is a new part of you, God, that I get to see. Doesn't make it right or wrong about the suffering, doesn't put a bow on it, but there's something, a character about God. There's a part of him, an experience of him, a relationship between him and I that we get to see in new ways because of suffering.
And that's what I loved what Jeff said towards the end of his message, which was quoting our friend Morgan, who has a lot of chronic health issues. And she said, the healing for me was finding the Lord in the suffering.
Wow.
And I just think, man, what a beautiful, and this is a woman who deals with chronic pain every single day, and medical question marks all over her life. And also some real life pain too. And has just found that there's so much value in finding the Lord in that suffering.
And that's what, I think as we wrap up Job, for me, I'm kind of going, Lord, help me to build that muscle memory. I want to find the purpose in the pain. But when I don't, I want to be able to be the kind of person that just keeps going. I want to keep coming back to the table and going, okay, Lord, I'm still frustrated about the thing I was frustrated yesterday and the day before that, but I'm going to keep coming back. I'm going to keep looking for you to be speaking to me. And I think that's the resilience that we need right now. I think that's the resilience that God is calling his people to be in. Because yes, we have hope, but sometimes hope is painful, and we're called to be resilient and strong, and that means we have to go through hard things. But when we do, I think we're able to be a light to the world a lot more than when we're protected from everything.
Yeah. So I'm curious, I feel like we're kind of rounding out here, but we still got some time. So I'm curious, with Keslie and then Ryan, any little thoughts that didn't have an easy connection, anything that you want to just squeeze in, even if it's a little non sequitur?
Not really. I mean, I think one of the things I love about Job and what I love about the whole Bible is just that it's a deep well, and that you got to work for it. And some of that is incredibly frustrating, and some of that is a gift that I know that God's given me a brain, and I wish it was smarter sometimes, so that I can use it, and that God really speaks, and that, for me, obviously with spiritual practices, that it matters so much that me personally and my students that I get to be in their lives, and our church and that stuff, that, man, we're practicing the way of Jesus, to use John Mark Comer's language, but really just the gift of Scripture of like, God really does see us in our pain. And sometimes it doesn't feel like it. And we get to tell him that, he is a kind God who says, come to me with your questions and doubts of where you think I'm not working. And he celebrates Job almost, you did it right and your friends did it wrong. And so it just makes me so grateful. It makes me love Jesus and love God and love Scripture even more. That's what I love about Job. It's just, it is confusing and it's mysterious, but also that gives me some hope of the things that are confusing and mysterious about my life. That's normal, right? And that doesn't make me sleep better at night sometimes, but also it gives me hey, you don't have to figure that out. Like that can be hard and painful, and you serve a God who you watched in Job be faithful. And so he is faithful. And so I think it's a cool book that is every time I go back, there's new stuff, and it just keeps pointing me back to the faithfulness of God that I'm so grateful for.
Do you have any, not to put you on the spot, and it's okay if you don't, any resources or books or anything like that you would recommend if someone want to dig deeper in Job or any of the tangential topics that you would recommend?
Yeah,
and we'll put these in the description.
That's great. Yeah, I love John Walton's stuff. I think is great. He's got a YouTube series on Job that is really, it's like, it's maybe like 20 or 30 parts. It's very long, but it's really approachable. And he is a college professor, and so he teaches really wonderful. And so I love his stuff. And then stuff on lament, I think, is great. There's a book called Prophetic Lament that is really great. And any kind of spiritual practices book. I think The Life You Always Wanted by John Ortberg and John Mark Comer's got great stuff on lament. That's just that real practical stuff of how do I learn this for me, for the future, and then how do I learn this for my friends.
Yeah, great.
That's awesome.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Ryan, any left field thoughts that you want to squeeze in?
Yeah, I do have one left field thought I'll throw in. The counsel of God in chapter 1, I think, brings up something that, again, as Christians, that we avoid. And it speaks to the mystery and, might I just say, the weirdness of God to some extent. When you read through the Old Testament, maybe you're like me, but it's like I will hear things like the counsel of God and go, oh, okay. And I kind of shelve that as like, that's interesting, kind of weird.
It's in the junk drawer.
Like, is that like his executive team that he meets with? Like, I'm not really picturing it, But there is something very interesting about that. And there's a book called The Unseen Realm that I think is actually a really great book. It's very dense. And we've talked a lot about that book. Daniel Riccio, I know this is for Daniel because I know he would have probably mentioned this book at some point. But it really dives into all the why does the Bible say that? That's weird, And there's these angelic beings, and what is that being, and what is this thing? And it's funny as you dive into that sort of stuff. It's actually really beautiful. It's so complicated. But this guy basically wrote a book on all the things that you kind of shelve and go, well, that's kind of confusing. He talks about all of that. And I would say really to what we hit at the last point, and David hit it and I hit it too, but that Ephesians 3 verse of, the unseen realm, the powers and principalities in the unseen realm and the spiritual realm are learning about the character of God by looking at the church. They're learning about the manifold wisdom of God, the multifaceted nature of God. You could look at him this way, and you could look at him this way. And I would say, I think the biggest thing that, to me, that was giving me comfort coming out of Job is there is this spiritual realm that's wild and crazy, and it's in control. Yes, we live in a well-run world, but we are surrounded by a lot of things that make us question that, But you look at that and you go, no, God has ordered the world. He's ordered the spiritual realm. And our lives don't just impact the people around us, they impact the unseen realm too, which is just wild to me. And I think as we're going through not just hard times, but in good times too, or comfortable times where we're just numbing ourselves or whatever it is, to constantly remind ourselves and each other, like Job is being reminded. And Job, that is the backdrop. Like his battle is spiritual. Yes, it's playing out in the physical realm, but it starts with a question: have you considered my servant Job in the spiritual realm? Like that is the thing that colors the whole book of Job. And I think for us, we have to engage in the spiritual realm. We have to understand that that's going on in the background, and in some ways is more real and more tangible than what we're going through here.
Yeah, and that's The Unseen Realm by Michael S. Heiser.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, it's a great book.
It's dense,
I love
though.
it. Yeah.
Like it's like a read a page and a half and then think really hard about what you
Come
just
back
read.
a month later.
Yeah,
Yes,
because what he's
exactly.
doing is he's diving in and saying, well, here's some of the things that we miss in translation. You know, some of the things that we feel are probably mysterious.
Yeah.
There actually are some answers in the scripture on some of these things when it comes to the spiritual realm that just kind of
just
gets
weird.
lost when we come over to the
They're
English.
descriptions and they're
Yeah.
explaining, but we're like, really?
Yeah, and then some of it's uncomfortable because in a society, you know, where we tend to read the Bible in English, and we've lost a lot of those things. We've created our own taxonomies of
Sure,
the spiritual realm that actually don't necessarily align with what you would see if you were reading it in the Greek.
Yeah.
And so that can be a little bit. There can be a little bit of dissonance there.
Yeah.
But I think that book is really good. I would say, you know, he continues down that vein. He's got a book on angels and on demons, and I think in those ones he gets a little. He's spending a lot of time in extra biblical sources.
Yes.
So I think
The demons book, I think you were saying, gets a little dicey.
Still worth reading for someone, I would say, but I think he does a better job keeping it close and tight in the unseen realm.
Yeah.
And then when he's kind of still milking that cow a little bit, he's going to a lot. I think going a little bit too much to extra biblical stuff to say this is what the ancient Hebrew worldview was might not be as much when you're looking at other Near Eastern cultures.
Sure. Yeah.
Certainly that influences and informs us some of what the Hebrew perspective might have been.
But I think, that
it's a
counsel
great
of God,
book.
if it brings up a question for anybody, it's
Yeah.
like, dive in a little bit there. There's
Yeah.
something very
That's good.
interesting and
Yeah, it's
unexpected
great.
when you dive into it.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful
Yeah.
book.
That's
Yeah,
good.
and mind-blowing, I would say,
It
in a lot of
is,
ways.
yeah.
Any other resources?
No, I mean, I've hit it really hard. Christopher Ash's book, Trusting God in the Darkness, I think is great. He's got a commentary, too, that I went to fairly often, especially in terms of that translation of blameless. He was really instrumental in laying out exactly that phrase. And so, I unpack that in some of my sermons. But his long-form study of Job is really good, too.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, no, and for me, I don't have any other little nuggets from left field or anything like that, but I would say just, Nancy Pearcey's book on Finding Truth, I think was really good. Anything by her is, it's big. She's just an incredibly intelligent woman, and her thought processes are so helpful. She really believes in let's think and use our minds and use reason, subservient to the Scripture and the Spirit of God. It's a wonderful book, but yeah, I'd say that one for sure in the book of Job. And for anybody at Living Streams or elsewhere, actually, we have a lot of book recommendations. If you go to livingstreams.org/library, you can find a number of different people from the church who've recommended some books. You can find different topics. You can actually look at the different sermon series that we've done, and get a little, see the books that we recommend on those sermon series that we use to kind of inform that. So, well, thank you guys so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. It's been a delight. Thank you guys for watching with us. Thanks for listening to us nerd out. We always enjoy doing that. We enjoy doing this after every single sermon. I enjoy doing this.
do too.
Probably
I like it.
quite a
love
bit
it.
more than is healthy. It's just a fun thing to do, to sit down and nerd out with some nerds about some of the most meaningful things that one could nerd out about.
Yes.
So thanks for being someone who watched all the way to the end of this very long podcast. Thanks for caring enough to nerd out with us. And if you go to Living Streams, come talk to any one of the three of us, or Jeff or Mark or David will be hard to reach for the next 10 months. Or Dan Riccio wasn't here today, but he's always got thoughts too. And we'd love to chat more with you guys about the book of Job or the Bible or whatever you're learning. So thanks for being with us, and we'll see you next time.